Okay, so last time we have discussed about the great idea of Lighthill, and actually Lighthill investigated jet noise being generated and coming out of a nozzle towards airplane industry, and he came up to the very famous power to the 8 law. When you have a free jet, what he assumed, then the acoustic power scales with the jet velocity, so the flow velocity to the power of 8. And then Curl had the idea that you can also include in the integral formulation any obstacles, and he then came again up to the integral formulation where we not only have the volume sources according to the Lighthill tensor, but also surface sources on solid bodies. So as we have seen, we would also need from the flow simulation the fluctuating pressure as well as velocity, which are coming up in the viscous term. However, as we know, the viscous term is more or less just influencing the wave propagation in a sense that it is damping, so it leads to a decay of the amplitude. So the main part is the pressure, and we have seen when we have a flow around obstacles, then the scaling of this surface source is to the power of 6 towards the velocity. So especially when we come up to lower Mach number flows, because jet flow is always high Mach number flow, then this surface term, so this pressure fluctuation on solid bodies is more dominant, and we get a kind of a dipole radiation pattern. This jet noise is a quadrupole radiation pattern you get out. And the full generalization has been done by Fox, Williams, and Hawkins, because they also took into account moving surfaces. So what we also now can model with this formulation is also propeller, helicopter, so rotor noise. And it is a similar approach as Curl, but they also, as just mentioned, can take into account moving surfaces, rotating structures, and is also based on this generalized function theory, as we call it, Distributionentheorie in German, where we have this Heaviside function, which we know is not a classical function, it is just a function in a generalized theory. Okay, this is quite complicated. The integral is coming out. We have it a little bit in our scripts, and we have also references where you can look up if you are interested in such parts. So just as summarizing a little bit, we can now clearly state the following. When we base our aeroacoustics on the inhomogeneous wave equation of Lighthill, then what is very important is that we solve, or we can solve, the partial differential equation already written for a pressure fluctuation, but we need correct boundary condition. If you directly apply the integral formulation, then it is clear. Lighthill has used the Green's function of free radiation, so there you already have this restriction. So when you have solid bodies, you have to use the integral formulation of Curl, and if they are moving, whatever, then just use the very generalized equation of Fox, Williams, and Hawkins. But coming back, when you solve the partial differential equation, and what is very important, as you know, you just get the correct solution if you also have on the whole boundary the correct boundary condition. Then you get a unique solution solving a partial differential equation. Then you can solve any aeroacoustic problem you have. We also clearly know that this Lighthill tensor here is a great challenge to obtain, especially for high Mach number flows as jet flows we have within airplane industry. because actually you have to solve the full set of compressible flow equations, including all structures, vortical structures, which are the typical structures of a flow, as well as wave structures. Yeah? And to resolve these different scales is more or less, even today, for high performance computing environment, something which you cannot apply for real practical problems. Okay, on the other hand, we should not forget that for some times and for some applications, especially the integral formulations are of great interest, because you are interested perhaps to get the acoustic pressure in a quite far distance from the flow, and then integral formulation is more efficient. Very often you cannot solve it directly, so you also need a numerical method, and the boundary element method is the method of choice you're using. For any of this integral formulation, you actually just get, from the theoretical point of view, the correct solution when you know the compressible fluid dynamics quantities within the volume for light hills tensor, as well as the pressure fluctuations and velocities on the surfaces of solid and elastic bodies or rotating bodies to get the correct solution. So in this case, we should perhaps really write this down. So here, actually, we always need compressible CFD, so computational fluid dynamics solution, and this we can use in the integral formulation. Okay, you will also find in literature sometimes that you use incompressible flow simulations, but it is just fulfilled in the approximate case for compact acoustic sources, meaning you have large wavelengths. Large wavelengths compared to the turbulent structures means that you have low Mach number, because then the velocity, flow velocity divided by the speed of sound gives you a small Mach number. Okay. Now, to get more physics in, there was the idea to really go towards the so-called vortex sound, because vorticity, which is the curl of the flow velocity, is a typical physical quantity describing flow structures. And now let's assume that the characteristic size of such a vorticity, such a vortical structure, we also call it the eddy, we have the size L, and we have a typical velocity U. And then you have the scaling law that the generated sound, and that is quite interesting that you have already this, you can show this, that the generated sound has a frequency of the order, this characteristic velocity over this length scale of the eddy, which means the smaller the eddies, the larger the frequencies being generated, the frequencies you really can get into the wave propagation. So this is a very important law to find out, and that you even can derive analytically. We will show some steps of it, not all the steps, it's quite involved. On the other hand, when this is, we know the frequency, we clearly also know the wavelengths. As we know, the wavelengths is the speed of sound over the frequency, and therefore our wavelengths we have within the radiated sound is of the order of this length scale of the eddy size and the Mach number. We know the Mach number, I write it down here, is just this characteristic velocity over c, the speed of sound. Which means that for low Mach numbers, then it is clear that you have quite large acoustic wavelengths. Yeah? For example, let's take Mach number 0.01, then you come up to a scaling factor of 100 between such a vertical structure and the radiated wavelengths of the sound. And you can do an analysis which has been done in 1970, and in this analysis you can find out that for low Mach number, that is now the important thing, so low Mach number, I would say perhaps low Mach number, I write it here, means about Mach number smaller 0.1. You can more or less approximate the light hill tensor by the Reynolds stresses. So you already see we model the flow as an incompressible flow. This IC means incompressible. Because we also have a constant density. And then we just take out the Reynolds stresses, we neglect the excess term and the additional viscous term in a light hill tensor. And from analysis, you can also find out that this incompressible velocity can be computed by the curl of this integral, where we have in here this omega is the vorticity. And this is for, if I write here, flow without obstacles. So you also have a free flow, you have no obstacles within the flow, because then you also can convert the partial differential equation in such an integral formulation. But the most important thing is this part here now. We model the flow as an incompressible flow. We get the full separation between flow structures and acoustic structures, because when you do the flow simulation, then you do not take into account any wave structures, because you assume an incompressible medium, and as we know, waves need a compressible medium. And then a further simplification was done by Powell, and Powell made the approximation of this light hill tensor L tilde already, which is computed by the incompressible flow velocity. And here is the following. This would be the correct part, the double divergence on this tensor product between the incompressible flow velocity vector. And you can, by vector identities, rewrite this by this term here, where we have the important part in, which is the vorticity, and a second part, which is, you see, the Laplacian of the dot product between the incompressible flow. And for a lot of applications, you can show that you can neglect this second term. So this is not of big importance for wave and therefore acoustic wave generation. And then you can rewrite Lighthill's wave equation with this approximation of the double divergence of Lighthill's tensor, so the right-hand side of the inhomogeneous wave equation of Lighthill. You can rewrite it also for free radiation. So again, important, what we have here is free radiation. And you can see we have our standard here Green's function with the delta generalized function, and important here is this source term we have, vorticity cross product with the incompressible velocity. And for this, you even get analytical solutions then for a single vortical structure, for a single eddy, so that you directly can see how these vortical structures generate acoustic sound. Okay, so what also is done then here, perhaps I should also name, you call this part here the so-called lump vector, and we will apply the far field approximation as we know, and you know for the far field approximation the spatial derivatives can be substituted by the time derivatives, resulting in this formulation, still quite complicated. Anyway, we have again here the important thing. This is the vector to the observer. This is our vector to the sources. We have in the vorticity and the incompressible velocity, and we know again the vorticity is computed by the curl of the velocity, which is the same as taking the curl of just the incompressible part, because the compressible part can be described by the gradient of any scalar potential, and the curl of a gradient is always 0. Okay, so also for the far field, then we have a formula which is then even easier to be evaluated, because instead of space derivatives, we have here time derivatives, and we then get also for some very simple cases, but that gives us the physics in for simple cases, how the fluctuating density as well as the fluctuating pressure is computed according to the vortical structures within the flow. Okay, so summarizing, we have here the very general formulation of light hill. We call it also an analogy, because actually he has done no approximations, also not any special ansatz like a perturbation ansatz we will discuss next. He just rearranges the equation of compressible flow in such a way that at the end he gets a wave operator and a sources, this light hill tensor. But we know this light hill tensor also includes not only vortical structures, but also wave structures and all the interaction between vortical structures and wave structures. So it is not a pure source term. Yeah? So it also includes the quantity itself for which you want to solve for this perturbed pressure, or for this fluctuating pressure or fluctuating density. So there is no clear separation. However, we can approximate it by just one term, which is the Reynolds stresses for low Mach number, and then we describe the sources by the incompressible velocities of the flow, which means then we have this separation. And then we can solve the partial differential equation, or when we have free radiation, we just use the integral formulation. When there are also obstacles, we have the integral formulation of curl or Fox, Willem, and Hawkins, which we can use. They are all based on the partial differential equation, the inhomogeneous wave equation of light hill. So there is nothing new from this part here concerning the partial differential equation. It is just always the difference how you come up to the integral formulation, where curl was able to include any scattering solid bodies, and Fox, Willem, Hawkins even extended to rotating systems within your computational domain. For all this formulation, we have there the integral formulation as well as the partial differential equations we have discussed. At the end, there is no clear separation. What we get out is fluctuating pressure, fluctuating density. Clearly in the far field, let's say, where there is no flow, this fluctuating pressure and density should converge to the acoustic pressure and density. However, since for most cases we have to solve numerically, you will also introduce numerical errors, and so you will perhaps also get numerical sound, which is not physically due to the numerical errors you always have within any numerical solution of an integral equation or a partial differential equation. Okay, and we see for the general case there is no real separation between flow structures and wave structures. When we then restrict to low Mach number, we get in this separation. However, still the solution you get is a fluctuating pressure or density, which means also for low Mach number flows, when you get this density fluctuation or pressure fluctuation, it is a superposition still of hydrodynamic, aerodynamic quantities and acoustic quantities. So we have no clear separation, but we get a better insight, a better meaning of the physics, especially when we go over to the idea of Powell, and then also further developed by Howe and colleagues, this vortex sound idea.
Excuse me?
Yes?
If you would do such an compressible flow simulation or computational fluid dynamics simulation with the goal of providing an acoustic field, what would the frequency range be? For which frequency ranges is this feasible? I mean, I guess it's not feasible for the whole audio spectrum that a human can hear, but what would be meaningful?
Yeah, it is up to you what you want to get and what is possible with your computer resources. So I would say we have already some very efficient research softwares. Most of them are even free. I have a good colleague at the University of Stuttgart. It is highly parallelized, and they really solve directly the compressible flow equation. And for example, they are now able to solve within 2 to 3 weeks on about 1,000 processors a practical problem like a flow around a side mirror, where you also have feedback mechanisms between the acoustic waves and the vertical flow structures. Yeah, but you see, I'm speaking about some weeks for getting the solution, which means you get terabytes, clearly. You have to store. You also want to do post-processing, so consider what you are doing in the post-processing. You should consider the following. When we discuss here about acoustics, then let's limit at 5 kilohertz. I think there we can limit. We don't have to go to higher frequencies. Okay, you will see then in some applications, PhD students will present like the turbocharger noise. We are working together with BMW. Well, you have frequencies up to 50, 60 kilohertz you don't hear, but the most prominent frequency is the blade passing frequency of the compressor wheel, and that is about 12 kilohertz. Yeah, and you know tonal noises are very annoying, and you want to resolve it. So for some cases, you have to go up to 15 kilohertz or something, but still you have to go to a finer time discretization when you do the compressible flow simulation. So a typical time step size is 10 to the power of -5. That means 10 microseconds, which means you have to solve the nonlinear compressible flow equations 100,000 times to get 1 second. And 1 second is something you cannot really hear, yeah, when you make an audio file out of it at any monitoring point. And you have to consider, you first have to solve for a lot of time steps until the flow is developed. Yeah, to give you an idea, when you do measurements at least for 30 seconds. And then you know, when you want to have a spectrum, you cut out overlapping time sequences for each of these time sequences, let's say of 1 second or 2 seconds, then you have, let's say 2 seconds, we have 15 overlapped time sequences. You do a Fourier transformation and then do a averaging. That's the standard way you do in practice when you do measurements. This is not feasible for simulations. So for high-end computing environment, as we do also at the Vienna Scientific Cluster, it's the biggest and largest and fastest computer in Austria. Yeah, you do really simulations for some weeks in order to get reasonable results. And here I'm speaking for practical application where we strongly restrict the computational domain. So it is not possible to include large domains and get then also included the acoustic quantities at some distances, let's speak of 2, 3, 4 meters, yeah, which you would be interesting if you do, for example, for a turbocharger setup the computation. That is why it is so important to understand the physics of how acoustics is generated by the flow, and then more or less have a model which is feasible so that you get results, let's say, within some days. And you will hear also when some of the PhD students will give their presentations about their research work. In industry, when you will see that most of them do a run simulation, so a Reynolds average Navier-Stokes solution, which means it is a static solution. Yeah, you don't have any time dependency in. Well, you see that some fluid structures there, but yeah, you cannot really use this to get acoustic sources. So yeah, I would say we are still far away to use it in the standard process in industry. We do it in research projects together with industry, and they are very interesting in this because the noise being generated of any technical devices is yeah, a big issue currently, especially for consumers. They want to have quiet devices, or at least they make noises, or let's say a sound which is acceptable. Therefore, we also speak from sound design. Yeah. On the other hand, you also know when you drive a car and you don't really hear the motor, perhaps then you also have a problem because you want to hear the sound of a motor. Yeah. Otherwise, it's not accepted, at least by some customers. So, but you also have generated sound, for example, in air conditioning systems with tonal components, and that is annoying. You don't want to have tonal components in this sense. Yeah? And so, yeah, it is still a big challenge and a lot of research to be done to understand these mechanisms, especially if you have feedbacks. Yeah, if you have a flow over a cavity, like a gap, a door gap you have, then clearly you have strong feedback from acoustics back to the flow structures, and yeah, then it gets very challenging when we not can separate and assume that we can model the flow as an incompressible flow. Okay, further questions? Okay, if this is not the case, then I want to go to the second class, I would say, of formulations. And the second class is not the analogy, because there we use the mathematical tool of perturbation ansatz. And I think you remember concerning our perturbation ansatz to get the acoustic wave equation out of the compressible flow equations. So here we do also a perturbation ansatz in a different sense. And our goal is now, at least for low Mach number flows, to get a clear separation and to get equations where we really solve for the acoustic pressure and acoustic particle velocity. So such perturbation ansatz is mainly composed of the following. We start here by a splitting of temporal mean and fluctuating quantities. Yeah? So that would mean, for example, that the velocity is somehow decomposed in a mean velocity plus some fluctuating velocity. And we know within the fluctuating velocity, we will have large amplitudes concerning the vortical structures, but we will also have amplitudes which are the acoustic particle velocity, which means that in the second approach, and that we can do, is to apply the Helmholtz decomposition. Do you know about the Helmholtz decomposition? You have heard it once, I hope, at least in electrical engineering. Yeah. And there you know that any physical field, vector field, let's call it U, can be described by the curl of a vector potential. I now use A, let's say U would be the electric field. Then we can decompose it by the curl of a vector potential describing the solenoidal part. Yeah, so the Wirbel field plus the gradient of any scalar potential. Let's call it psi. Yeah, typically that would be the decomposition in such a sense that A is the magnetic vector potential and psi is the electric scalar potential. That is what you perhaps have heard in electrical engineering. But this is, the Helmholtz decomposition is very general, but it somehow is restricted because we assume that we have a physical field which goes towards zero at infinity. So this is not really applicable to computational results of, for example, you have a compressible flow, because you always compute the compressible flow on a limited domain. Yeah, we have to limit the computational domain, so the velocity is not zero at the boundary of your computational domain. So all this Helmholtz decomposition, at least I guess you have heard, was in such a case that your physical vector field is zero at infinity, and you consider it in an analytical framework and decompose it in these two vector fields, a pure solenoidal field, so a pure Wirbel field, and in a pure source sink field, which we also call a irrotational field. And in this sense, we then have, as you can see, get out from this velocity fluctuation a part which we associate with the flow structures. So we get the incompressible flow. So this is for us the incompressible flow velocity. And the second part, what we get out, is the compressible part, which we already which we already associate to the acoustic particle velocity. Therefore, we have this A here. This is a very good approximation in this sense, when we already say that the compressible part is the acoustic particle velocity, but just for low Mach number flows. If you have high Mach number flows, within the compressible part, you will have also some flow structures as well as wave structures. Okay, but anyway, we have a mathematical tool which is called the Helmholtz decomposition, but you know, this mathematical tool is just correct for a vector field. Now, for the overall pressure, we do the same decomposition as you can see here. For the fluctuating part, to decompose it in an incompressible part and in a compressible part, we already call the acoustic pressure. This is clearly an approximation because we don't have such a decomposition for a scalar quantity. Anyway, for low Mach number flows, this makes sense. So that is, as you see here, therefore in the title we have low Mach numbers. Now, when we take these two ansatz and put it in our compressible flow equations, you have to do a lot of mathematical rearrangements, also some approximations, which I don't want to discuss here, would take quite a lot of time and would be beyond the scope of our course here. Anyway, if you're interested, we have in the script here references to journal publication and PhD thesis. What we get out, and that is now a very interesting part, what you can get out for low Mach number flows, again, that we now get two equations where the first equation here is the conservation of mass, and you see it is a linear partial differential equation. And we directly solve for the acoustic pressure and the acoustic particle velocity, and we have a convective term in, which is given by this term here. So it is the mean velocity dot product with the gradient of the acoustic pressure. And importantly is the right-hand side. So you see this is the substantial derivative of the incompressible pressure, so which we get out from an incompressible flow simulation. It is the time derivative plus this convective term, which is the part of the mean flow with the gradient operator. Okay, and the second equation is a linearized equation for the conservation of momentum. Again, we have here the particle velocity, the acoustic pressure, so the acoustic quantities, and again we have a convective term, as we can see here, where we have an interaction between the mean velocity of our incompressible flow and the acoustic particle velocity. Now, if you look in detail to it, and you would now just cancel out or just take away these red parts, so I just make it in green, so you just put it out because you say, okay, I have no mean flow and I have no incompressible pressure, then we would have our standard linearized conservation equation for linear acoustics. Right? So this is of great interest, as you can see. These are so-called acoustic perturbation equations here, as they are called, due to our perturbation ansatz. And what is nice now and different to our light hill formulation, also for the low Mach number flow, where we have also just the incompressible velocities within the source term, is that we solve for the acoustic pressure and the acoustic particle velocity, which is not the case for the light hill analogy in the low Mach number regime, where we still solve for a pressure fluctuation or density fluctuation. Okay, so this is of great interest, so I hope I get this away now. Yes. Okay, so this is now a very important result, I would say, especially for low Mach number flows. And in a lot of applications, we have low Mach number flows. Even the flow around the car, still at 200 kilometers per hour, it is low Mach number. And when we have any ventilators or whatever technical machines, we can apply such an ansatz and such an approach where we model the flow as an incompressible flow and get here then the source terms. Yeah, here are our source terms. These are the source terms by the incompressible pressure, time derivative, and convective space derivative, and we directly solve for the acoustic pressure and particle velocity. So even in the domain where we have the flow, we have the separation and solve directly for the acoustic quantities. So important is now, you see, we have as a source term the substantial derivative, because this we can also write with operator d dt. This is the substantial derivative, is the time derivative plus our mean velocity. So I can rewrite this as d dt of the incompressible pressure. Okay, and as already told quite often, we directly solve for the acoustic quantities. However, numerical solutions are quite computational demanding, because we have to solve for four unknowns, the three unknowns of the particle velocity and the unknown pressure, acoustic pressure. So it is quite heavily compared to a wave equation where we just have a scalar unknown. In this sense, what was one of our main research achievements in the last years was that we used the property that, as you also know, we have discussed it, and I think you also have known it before, that the curl, more or less, actually it is the time derivative of the acoustic particle velocity is zero. Anyway, what we know, our acoustic particle velocity is a irrotational field, which means that we can describe it by a scalar potential. Yeah, as we do it in electrostatics, the electric field is described by the gradient of the scalar electric potential. And now, if we substitute this here into our first equation, which is a linearized momentum equation, then we can, since we also have here the gradient, we have here the nabla operator, and we have here the nabla operator, we can rewrite it together inside a nabla operator, which is now this one. So we have the nabla operator operating on the pressure, operating here on this scalar term, because we have the dot product between the mean flow velocity and the gradient of the scalar potential. And this is just a time derivative, so it's a scalar quantity. And since this has to be zero, it is clear that it is zero when we express the... Okay, I see there is at least a small mistake. There should be a minus here. I think you know it. There should be a minus, yeah, because we have this minus here. And so if we express that this term is equal to zero, then clearly the gradient is also zero. Well, you also can integrate over space. Then we would have, as a right-hand side, an additional constant function in space, but you know, constant function in space and not depending on time is not relevant for acoustics. We always need fluctuating time changing quantities in order to receive it as acoustic waves. And so you see that we can express now the acoustic pressure as the substantial time derivative of the scalar potential with the mean density. And when we substitute this now into the linearized mass conservation of our acoustic perturbation equations, which is again written here. So we just substitute this relation here in here, and we also have to substitute it in here. What we get out, and clearly we have our standard relation, which we substitute in here between particle velocity and scalar potential. What we get out at the end is again a wave equation. And that is great because we have a scalar unknown. In this case, now it's the scalar acoustic potential. And it is a kind of a convective wave equation because we have this substantial derivative, as shown here, the substantial derivative also in the wave operator. And importantly is that we have here also a clear source term, which is, again, as you can see here, the substantial derivative on the incompressible pressure. So you see, this is again a very important thing because we don't have a higher order derivative. It's just a first order derivative in time and space for the incompressible pressure, because we have to consider that we do a numerical computation in order to get this incompressible pressure by fluid dynamics simulation. And as a rule of thumb, each derivative reduces the order of accuracy by 1. Right? If you apply a second order accurate scheme in space and time, and you do just a first order derivative on the achieved numerical quantities, then you still have first order accuracy. If you would have a second order space and time derivative, well, you would have zero order accuracy. So also from the numerical point of view, it is very important that there is just a first order derivative, as it is also the case in these acoustic perturbation equations, which we have started from, and we have just a scalar unknown. So this is very efficient now to be solved, for example, with the finite element method. And we still have all the other properties we have in the acoustic perturbation equations for the particle velocity and acoustic pressure. We don't have done here any approximation. So it is just a reformulation by the acoustic scalar potential. Okay, so let's have a final overview of all our formulation. So we have started actually with the aeroacoustic analogies, and so we get classical equations. Classical equation, I should write here clearly light hill. However, we don't solve for real acoustics. We solve for fluctuating pressures, fluctuating densities. And the physics to get out of this equation is not so clear for the classical equations, which means this is especially Lighthill's inhomogeneous wave equation, also his reformulation for free radiation in the integral form, the same then for Curl as well as Fox-Wilhelm and Hawkins. To get more physics in, I think the vortex sound idea, and also called vortex sound equations, are of great interest, because there we clearly see the vortical structures, so the vorticity we have within the flow generate sound. However, we also do not solve for real acoustic. We again just solve for fluctuating pressure and fluctuating density, being a superposition, somehow a superposition between acoustics and flow. And there is also the dilatation equation of Ribner, which would be our perturbed convective wave equation without the convective terms. So that is was very interesting that we came up when we just neglect the convective terms to his equation. However, he had no clear derivation of these equations as we could do based on the acoustic perturbation equations. So coming out of this, we have all our analogies, which are these three ones. Sorry. That is okay. There happened something which is not as nice. So our integral formulation, at least we have here light hill, no real acoustic, curl, also no real acoustic because always perturbation. Fox-Wilhelm Hawkins, sorry, is wrong. So again, as we know, not really acoustics because you also solve for these quantities, fluctuating quantities, and there is also something we have not discussed and we just want to name it here, that is Kirchhoff. You have ever heard of the Kirchhoff integral in acoustics? Yeah, okay, then you know. You can also use any surface, yeah, and when you know there the pressure and the acoustic particle velocity on this surface, and that could be any surface, it is not necessary that it is the surface of a solid body or whatever, then you can use the Kirchhoff integral formulation and compute to the far field the acoustic pressure, for example. However, what you need is, yeah, let's look here. Say this is a Kirchhoff surface. What we need then clearly here is that we solve inside the domain here the full compressible flow equations and hope that the surface is so far away that the fluctuating pressure and velocity is already the acoustic pressure and velocity. Yeah. And then clearly from this surface, yeah, which means you need a computational scheme which can resolve the vortical structures and the wave structures up to this surface. And then from there, clearly you just apply the Kirchhoff surface integral and you can compute to any far field monitoring point and get there the acoustic pressure. Yeah. This is also something which have been used, especially when the flow is very confined, so it is restricted to small domains. However, it is a big challenge to get there really solutions which resolve the vertical and the acoustic wave, the vertical structures of the flow and the acoustic waves up to this surface. But that is also a nice possibility. We will not discuss in detail, but perhaps if you do some investigation in aeroacoustics, you will also find this integral formulation, which we classical know from acoustics. Okay, then we have our vortex sound theory, and here are three names which are very famous. This is the name Howe. You find also his book in the references of our script. Howe has become very famous. He still is alive because he also extended somehow Powell's idea of the vortex sound. Then there is Anne Doak, also still living. They are both in Cambridge. And also very well known is Möhring, a German scientist. And you see that they reformulated from Lighthill's equation to some vortex sound equation, including flow effects in the operators, more or less. As you know, when we look at the standard light hill inhomogeneous wave equation, you have no convective operators there. So you have no interaction in the operator between flow and acoustics. You have this classical wave operator with the perturbed pressure or density. And what they tried is to get interactions between flow and acoustics from light hill's tensor into the wave operator. This was more or less the main work they did, and they did it for different Mach numbers, and then different vortex sound equations came up. There is also an interesting relation to classical acoustic. Pierce, Alan Pierce, still living in the US, very famous acousticians, and he also wrote a very famous book, Introduction to Acoustic, but I would say it's not Introduction to Acoustics. It is Advanced Acoustics with a lot of derivations and mathematics. And he also derived an acoustic wave equation with a convective operator, but that was in the context of mainly ultrasound. Yeah, if you are modeling ultrasound, so sound within water at frequencies up to megahertz, and you have some mean flow within the fluid, then he tried to find out the approximate wave equations taking interactions between a flow and acoustic wave propagation. So he was not engaged in aeroacoustics, he was just interested in acoustic wave propagation, where the waves also go through a domain where you have a background flow. Okay, so this is vortex sound, still no clear separation, still somehow you saw for the perturbed, not for the perturbed, for the fluctuating pressure and density, including both flow and acoustic parts. And a real separation has been done by applying perturbation ansatz and go with the perturbation ansatz to the flow equation. But as we know, to really get directly the equations for acoustic pressure and velocity, this is somehow, especially when I write it, these two here, we are restricted to low Mach number. You also have so-called perturbed compressible equations. They are called by my colleague Moon from South Korea. A very interesting derivation. However, you can even apply it to high Mach number flows, but the quantities for which you solve these perturbed equations are still fluctuating pressure and fluctuating velocity. So they both include also vortical structures, so flow structures. Okay, yeah, and some special forms are just obtained by some Mach number scaling. So you get some special equations dedicated to high Mach numbers, dedicated to low Mach numbers, and the Helmholtz decomposition is a very strong mathematical tool. So Stefan, for example, was focusing on Helmholtz decomposition in his PhD thesis, and there he extended the classical Helmholtz decomposition to a Helmholtz decomposition on restricted domains. So the classical Helmholtz decomposition is for the infinite domain, where you assume that your physical quantity, your vector field, is zero at infinity. However, when you do a Helmholtz decomposition on a restricted domain where on the boundary your vector field is not zero, yeah, then it is quite challenging and you have to extend the classical Helm decomposition to further physical fields coming up, and these are not only this vector potential and scalar potential we have discussed before. Okay, at the end, I just want to demonstrate you a simple case and simulations we have done to demonstrate really the great challenges you have, but also the possibility to solve in the flow domain for the acoustic quantities. And the case is a cylinder in cross flow. And in this case, you even don't really see it. It is a cylinder which is positioned here. It is so small that for this large domain being here shown, you don't see it. And it is just, these are three-dimensional computations, but it is just on the crossing plane. And it is even for low Reynolds numbers, as you can see here, so that we could resolve within a incompressible flow simulation. So we have all these are based, so the results of shown here are based on incompressible flow simulations. And as you can see, once we use the light hill tensor, which is shown here, and what you see here is clearly P prime. It's the perturbed pressure. We cannot really decompose it in the fluid part, the flow part, and the acoustic part. A little bit better are the results when you use the Laplacian of the incompressible pressure. You know, we can reformulate the double divergence of the light hill tensor for low Mach numbers, where we just take the incompressible velocities to be the Laplacian of the incompressible pressure. So you see, although this is from the analytical point of view the same, numerically you get results which are not so perturbed, but still it is here P prime. And you see also nicely here the vortex street, the von Karman vortex street. Yeah, you also see it nicely here. But you see, let's say at least for this part here, you do not see really nice wave propagation. They are somehow perturbed. Here it is perhaps already better. Very interesting is when we go here to our perturbed convective wave equation. However, we just take into account the time derivative of the incompressible pressure. So since it is a so low Mach number flow, we have not taken into account the convective source term. You see here clearly the wave structure, how waves are propagating away from the cylinder. And if you use the acoustic, this is also called the Aeroacoustics wave equation. You will also find it. It is nothing else as the PCWE, a perturbed convective wave equation, without convective terms. Yeah? So you throw away all the convective terms and then you get it here. But what you also see, the source term is then here a second time derivative on the incompressible pressure. So you see the benefit of the perturbed convective wave equation, where, as you see here, it is just a first order time derivative, and we have just neglected it. Anyway, what we also see here, we see here nice wave structures, but we see also some small perturbations here coming from the von Karman vortex street. So you see it is not pure acoustics what we get out, but quite nice acoustic wave structures. The best results for this case we have obtained by the perturbed wave equation. Yeah, and then just important for me is that for this aeroacoustic wave equation, which is a subset of the perturbed convective wave equation, and the perturbed convective wave equation, we really solve for the acoustic quantities. You get really the acoustic waves you want to compute, and for all other formulation, even for the low Mach number case where we base our acoustic or we base our simulations on incompressible flow simulations, we get strongly perturbed waves, perturbed because they are perturbed by the flow structures here, because you solve for, that is important, you solve here for fluctuating pressure and not for the acoustic pressure. Yeah? Here we really solve for the acoustic pressure. Okay, so this is clearly just an academic example, but it strongly demonstrates you that for the low Mach number case and using this acoustic perturbation equation or its reformulation in this perturbed convective wave equation, we can really have a correct separation between flow and acoustics, and we get the acoustic pressure even within the flow domain. Okay, do you have any questions concerning now this overview?
Yes, I have a question.
Yeah, of course.
So just I want to really understand what these pictures mean.
Yeah.
Is it true that, for example, the cylinder, I imagine it like a very long chimney, and the flow would be the wind that flows
Exactly.
along the
Perhaps,
chimney.
yeah,
So
perhaps I should.
wind, yeah.
Yeah, I should write it in a cross section. So in order to have fully defined boundary conditions for the flow, it is actually this one in the cross section. This is the cylinder, yeah, and here is the flow coming in. And then you clearly get here also vortical structures. So it is somehow the flow around the cylinder, and in order to make it pseudo two-dimensional, we even have, and that is I should show, we even have changed this a little bit and made a kind of a channel where you have in here totally your cylinder. Yeah. But you have to see it three-dimensional. Yeah. So when you look from top, yeah, so the height of the cylinder is also the height of the channel. When you look from the top, it is like this. Yeah, and here you have the inflow. And that is what we mean with pseudo two-dimensional. It is a three-dimensional computation for the flow, but it is in a channel where the height of the cylinder is exactly the height of the channel.
Okay, so the flow produces some sound which goes goes radially away from the chimney.
Yes,
so to
yes,
speak.
yes. Now
So
this is.
Can I imagine it like when I blow over a bottle?
Yes.
Is this
no? That is cavity sound.
Okay.
Yeah. So when you drink, yeah.
I don't the opening of the chimney at the top is not important. It's just
no.
the
It is,
air
and it is not opened.
it.
Yes, it is not opened. It is a closed cylinder. It is not open.
Okay.
It is not open.
Okay.
Okay. And clearly, this would be for CFD, and for the acoustic simulation, yeah, it is different, because for the acoustic simulation, we really have no channel, yeah, and you really have your cylinder, yeah, and that is in free space, yeah. So we have put away the channel, but use the CFD result to get the sources, and then did here free radiation with the only obstacle, which is the cylinder. So the two computational domains differ between flow and acoustics, but it is just to demonstrate that you get out here really acoustic waves, even in the flow domain, when you use such perturbed convective wave equations.
So why is the vortex street not important for acoustics?
No, it is important. Fine.
Okay, so then
you get here a vortex street.
Okay.
And you have here an inflow, and you have here outflow boundary condition. Yeah, and on all other boundaries, you fix that the flow velocity is 0. Because on a solid boundary, the flow cannot penetrate it, it's just 0. It is just to have defined boundary conditions for the flow. We clearly also did really flow around open domain, so a cylinder in open space. We did measurements, simulation, compared it with it, and you get very nice results. But in this case, we wanted to have really defined flow boundaries and situations, and show then that you really get out pure acoustics when you use the perturbed convective wave equation, and when you use any light hill analogy, that you get out this fluctuating pressure, and just in the far field, they get more or less the same values. It's not totally the same values, due to the fact that you also make numerical errors when you do the flow computation, and therefore you get also numerical sound and not only physical sound. Yeah. Okay, any further questions?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Another question to this topic from my side. So in my I imagined these effects every time now, like the curl or the vortex that's induced through the cylinder is a source term for the acoustic field.
Yes.
And now in the simulations, it seems to be that the cylinder is a actual source term for the acoustic field. Is that right?
No.
So I thought the vortex street would be the center of or the different curls of the vortex street, or the different vortexes of the vortex street would be the actual source terms, and therefore the acoustic field would be centered around these source terms.
No, you get
what I mean?
always no, because you always get radiated sound. So what we have computed is clearly in the whole domain, in the whole domain, or shown here as a zoom on the whole computational CFD domain. We have computed the double divergence of the light hill tensor, or the Laplacian of the incompressible pressure, or here the second time derivative of the incompressible pressure, or the first order time derivative on the whole computational domain of the CFD.
Yeah. And the resulting acoustic field is then shaped like this from the simulation.
Yes, exactly. So I don't have
and
here
it's
now.
Centered around this cylinder.
Yeah, but you also have clearly source terms along the vortex street.
Okay, okay.
So you cannot say I limit my source region just around the cylinder. That would be not correct.
Yeah. No, but it's interesting for me to see that the acoustical field, the actual field what we are simulated, is more or less centered around the cylinder. And
yes,
in
yes,
my
imagination,
imagination, it would be more or less a little bit behind the cylinder. You know what I mean?
Yes, I know what you mean.
In the
Yes.
direction of flow.
Yes. But that you don't see because it is a so low Mach number flow. So actually, perhaps I don't have, when I put this away, what is of great interest is the following. Perhaps I just show you now a little bit the directivity pattern as follows. So, okay. So if this is the cylinder, then the waves are more or less radiating in this way. Yeah. And here in this way, so it is like you would have a dipole. And you see that it is a little bit aligned opposite to the direction of the flow, because the direction of the flow, that is the direction of the flow. Yeah. And what you really will see, the higher the flow velocity, the larger the alignment of the radiation pattern upstream. Yeah. So then you would even get the higher the flow, you would have perhaps a wave vector which is going in the even more upstream direction. And you have a compression of the waves in upstream and expansion in downstream direction. And now, clearly, if you look at this, you could say, well, I think just important is the region around the cylinder, yeah, because it seems as we have sources, let's say, on this surface of the cylinder and this surface, and therefore we get this radiation pattern, yeah. But it is still important to take also into account the vortex street for sources. What we should also consider is that actually we have a large wave number. So the diameter is 1 meter, yeah, but I'm not sure, but I think lambda is about 200 meters. so as we know, the wavelength scales with 1 over the Mach number, and I think the Mach number was here 0.01 or something, which means it is 100 times larger as a vortical structure. And so it is difficult. You need a really large domain. That is why you don't see the cylinder in the plots here. So it is so small because we need a large computational domain for acoustics in order to see a little bit here these wave structures. Otherwise, you would not see it there. This is also a big topic in computational aeroacoustics. Can we somehow limit the source region? It is, it is a hot topic. Actually, the best is always to take the full CFD domain as a source region and don't limit it to just some parts of the CFD domain when you do the acoustic simulation.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Further questions? Okay, then we can conclude here this topic. I just have here the last slide. You know, you also have to do a homework, and you should not do all the tasks here. It is just the red one. You will also find it in the Teach Center, that just number 1, 3, 4, and 6 should be as your homework, because you also have exercises and the others will be discussed within the exercises. So here what you have to hand in via the Teach Center are just the questions 1, 3, 4, and 6. And next time Stefan will go on and will discuss with you the topic concerning measurements, yeah, because this is also very important. I would say aeroacoustics is a typical physical topic where you need both. We cannot just do simulations or just measurements. It is a combination of both. Yeah, when you do simulation, it's nice because you get the full physical flow field, acoustic field. You can use your virtual microphone at any position. You can look at isosurfaces. You can look at the vortical structures. This you can never resolve with measurement techniques. On the other hand, it is always a model. It's not reality. Yeah? But when you do an experiment, you have reality, and you can do and measure at least, let's say, with microphones, you can do measurements directly in the flow to get the flow pressures. You have hot wire probes to measure flow velocities, and then you even have such advanced methods as LDA, so laser Doppler anemometry, to get even at crossing planes the velocity reconstructed, but not with a resolution you would need to use such data and compute out of the measured data the acoustic sources. This is currently not feasible, but it is some groups, international groups are working on it, that you say, okay, I have advanced measurement technologies where I really get a flow field such resolved that with these measurements I can directly compute the sources and then get by simulations the acoustic field. You have to consider you need the resolution both in time and space. Yeah, and this I have told you, well, to get really good resolutions in classical flows, you need a sampling time which is about 10 microseconds. Yeah, and you need to resolve in space, perhaps within micrometers. So that would, at the end, currently is not feasible with PIV, which is particle image velocimetry, or LDA, so with laser Doppler anemometry, but it is working on it. They call it then high-speed LDA or high-speed PIV or whatever. But still, high speed would mean that you have, let's say, a sampling frequency of perhaps 10 kilohertz. Yeah? But we would need 100 to 500 kilohertz sampling frequency to really resolve it in time. And then you have to consider how can you resolve it in space. What is also clearly strongly applied here are acoustic cameras, so that you have a lot of microphones somehow distributed in space, and then with all the microphone signals you try to compute back where the sources are. Yeah, so the classical array techniques in acoustics are also applied here in aeroacoustics. Yeah, and you just call it acoustic camera because you then visualize somehow with the reconstructed signals, reconstructed sources, source maps, and project it on the geometry to show where are the main sources which you obtain by array techniques with a lot of microphones. Okay, so this will be then the next topic starting with next week. Okay, are there any further questions? Comments?